Hello, my name is George Boystones. I'm at the University of Toronto, and welcome to Philosophy Bytes. And thank you to the Ancient Philosophy Group at Turin for inviting me to take part. As we're all looking for new outlets for our creativity at the moment, I thought it could be especially appropriate to think about the role of creative activity in Plato's conception of the world, because it's something I think that isn't always given the appreciation that it deserves. Now, it's well known that Plato believes that the universe was created. Through the character of Timaeus in the dialogue named after him, he gives us his reasons for thinking that the universe has a prior cause, and he describes this cause as an intellect, one which operates much like human creative intelligence. It's compared at various times to a potter or a metalworker, for example. But most often Plato refers to it simply as the craftsman, the Demiurgos, the Demiurge. But the thing that gets less attention is the fact that the universe created by this divine craftsman is itself a creative being, and full of other creative beings too. It isn't some precious but inert bibelot that Plato's God creates, a Fabergé's egg. It's something alive and intelligent, and something that immediately creates new life within itself, life which in its own turn creates and procreates. And the fact that the universe is creative in this way is at least as important for Plato's wider philosophical vision as the fact that it was created. Now, we need to begin by looking very closely at what it is that Plato's craftsman god actually makes, because it turns out that he makes rather less than you might have assumed, especially if you come to Plato with your expectations set by the creation narrative in Genesis. Of course, the whole universe is the craftsman's project, and in one very important sense, everything in it owes its being to him. But he doesn't actually make everything himself. Of course, he doesn't make matter for a start. He doesn't create ex nihilo, and that's one important difference with the way that Genesis was read by later Jewish and Christian authors anyway. But that's less interesting to me than what he does with this matter, how much of the furniture of the universe he's responsible for. So, he does make the elements out of this matter. He makes earth, air, fire, and water. And out of these, in turn, he makes a sphere, which is to be the body of the universe. Then, perhaps more unexpectedly, he makes a soul to animate this body. Not immediately clear why he does this. The reason he gives at the time is that only things with souls are capable of intelligent thought, and things that are capable of intelligent thought are just better than things that aren't, he says. Well, I'll come back to that later on. In the meantime, creation moves forward, and God decides to put his experience at creating one living being to use in creating some more living beings. He turns out more souls, he assigns them, this time to a host of luminous bodies that he sets up within the universe, basically all the stars and the planets. And he dignifies these beings with the title of gods. And scholars generally refer to them as the created or secondary gods. And then, well, that's it. That's where the divine craftsman stops crafting. Thanks to him, the universe has its spherical structure, is populated by the heavenly bodies. That's it. If you're keeping score, this is just about where the god of Genesis gets to at the end of the fourth day of his creative period. Actually, there were a little bit less, because by this point, the god of Genesis had created plant life as well. Still, if the universe of Genesis has plants, the universe of the Timaeus has intellects, and that's basically the reason that God gives for stepping back at this point. Plato's craftsman god wants his creatures to use their intelligence to finish off the rest of the job. He can't do it himself, he says, because he's simply incapable of making things that don't last forever. And while that's okay for the elements and the universe and the heavenly bodies, the realm of sublunary nature, all of life on Earth, is going to require a cycle of life and death. This is work that only the secondary gods can do. So he gives them the leftovers of his preparation for soul, and he charges them to make suitable bodies for the various animals, which means, of course, suitably mortal bodies. The created gods are, in effect, charged to become the creators of the whole realm of sublunary nature. Now, a great deal, perhaps the majority of modern scholarship on Plato, has found this act of delegation very hard to take seriously, and a lot of the work on the Timaeus, and indeed on its reception, is built on an attempt to efface it. And that can go in one of two directions. A minority argue that the craftsman god doesn't hand over anything at all to the secondary gods. There's a sort of metaphor at play here. What's really happening is that Plato is revealing to us that the craftsman was never something distinct from these secondary gods at all. The pretense that he was a pious fiction, kind of placeholder. What we're now finding out, these scholars say, is that the real creator is the world soul. More commonly, though, readings of Plato move in the other direction. Not to say that the world soul or the secondary gods are the real craftsmen, but to deny that the secondary gods exercise any real intelligence or creativity of their own. In fact, I'd say that's almost the default reading of the Timaeus nowadays, that secondary gods are supposed to be no more than workshop assistants, robotic instruments of the craftsman's will. They do the work, sure, it's beneath God himself, but the work they do is really just colouring in. The properly creative choices are all his. But the text of the Timaeus could not be clearer, I think. Plato takes us in fine detail through the creative decisions that the secondary gods have to make, explicitly reminding us along the way, just in case we forget, that the craftsman has handed the task of making these decisions on to them. They have to work out the morphology of the body. They have to design the organic structures needed to sustain life. Plato methodically reconstructs their reasons for creating the liver, the spleen, the bowels, the pulmonary system. In a famous passage, he describes the thought they put into designing a skull that will be just thick enough to offer reasonable protection to the brain, but without being so thick that it deforms or stifles it. Not once does Plato describe these gods as assistants. On the contrary, they're referred to in their own right as craftsmen. Demiurge is the same word that's used of the original god. Their thought process, their activities, are described in the very same language with the very same verbs. There's nothing to suggest that they are not every bit as creative as the god who started it all off, albeit on the slightly smaller canvas that he left for them. There's nothing to suggest that they're not doing exactly as he told them to do. Copy the power I used to create you, he tells them. And I think Plato actually needs this second level of creativity within his vision of the universe. I think that serious explanatory gaps open up when you remove it. One has to do with the way in which Platonic forms operate as causes. When God says that he cannot create mortal bodies, which was his reason for bringing the secondary gods in at this point, this looks to me like an allusion to a problem that Plato spells out as the greatest challenge for his theory in another work, the Parmenides. In the Parmenides, Plato identifies a potential chasm, a radical disconnect, between the causal principles of his system, where the craftsman god in the Timaeus belongs, and the messy complexity of transient individuals, which they are supposed to control. The suggestion that the two realms can be spanned by an intermediate class of created creators looks like a promising attempt to address this problem, and we shouldn't dismiss it out of hand. Conversely, if you take the line that the real creator is the world's soul, I think you rather miss the point of the original motivation for raising the question of creation. The original point wasn't to put a name to the inventor of the pulmonary system or to find out who to thank for the thickness of our skulls. The point was to explain why there's an ordered universe at all. But that's something that can only be explained by some causal principle which stands outside of it. At least, it can only be explained that way within a Platonist conception of what counts as an explanation. It's true that later on the Stoics were to experiment with a creator god who operates within the universe, but that goes hand in hand with an entirely different account of causality too. I think the worry that people have here is that if God doesn't craft everything himself, then there's a lot, including most of what we care most about, that he's not responsible for at all. But that really doesn't follow. If you give me the money to buy myself a meal I couldn't otherwise afford, I have you to thank for the meal, even if you leave it to me to choose what I have, even if I buy the ingredients and make it myself. The secondary gods create only because the craftsman made them capable of doing so, and they create within the parameters that he sets. There's another metaphor used of God in the Timaeus. He's the father of the universe, as well as its craftsman. And we're told that he's guided by the natural parental aspiration that his child should be like him. But that means being creative too. Remember, he himself tells them they are to imitate the very creativity that he used to create them. So the fact that his children are genuinely and creatively productive is a mark of the success of his own creative ambitions, not the opposite. There's a reason why people take pride in what their children do, or in the achievements of their pupils, come to that. Their creativity is at least part of what our creative investment in them was meant for. And that's how it is with God and the world. He creates it to be creative. It's a mark of his success that it is. Actually, it's quite remarkable that everything the craftsman touches becomes not only immortal, as he points out, but also creative. At 2 points in the Timaeus, the very elements which he creates are described as craftsmen as well, literally as demiurges, that word. Now, the creativity of the elements is, to be sure, very limited. It comes about by chance rather than deliberation, because the elements don't have their own intelligence. In fact, they really do merely assist, and that language of assistance and instrumentality is used of them. But all of that just makes it clear how important it is to Plato that the secondary gods, who are intelligent, do also have full creative autonomy. And indeed, I think that's the answer to the question I raised earlier about why God thought that the universe would be better if it were intelligent and so gave it a soul. The reason turns out to be that this is the way to make the universe most like God himself. Its aptitude for autonomous creativity is, in some sense, its most important and most divine feature. But of course, we also have that ability. In fact, we've been exploring the whole topic through metaphors taken from human artistic activity. So this, finally, is where the topic bears on ethics too. Humans were created and crafted to be maximally intelligent actors in the sublunary world. Remember all that work on the skull? And if it matters that the universe is made intelligent and creative in order to be like God, it matters that we are too. Plato elsewhere defines human virtue as coming to be like God as much as possible. And there's something attractive and plausible in the thought that this involves more than detached contemplation, which is what people sometimes take this to mean, but that it involves the active and intelligent production of beauty and order where there was emptiness or chaos before. Attractive and plausible and deeply Platonic. Think about how the Symposium offers a unifying account of all human endeavour in terms of our desire to give birth to something new and beautiful that only we could have created. The divine craftsman then makes makers. And when Plato, or his later followers come to that, emphasize the creativity of the secondary gods, that's not a signal that we were wrong to view the two things as distinct, or that the world soul is the real creator. It isn't. The craftsman, par excellence, is the God who creates the whole universe. The secondary gods do a lot. In particular, they create life on Earth, but that's exactly what the creator created them to do. Thank you for watching.